Hi everyone, my name is Amrik, and I'm the Director of Customer Success at Debility, the makers of the SurveyCTO data collection platform. I'm here today to talk to you about decentralized deployment of data collection projects. Before we get started, please have a look at the message I've pasted into the chat window. The first link you'll see is a web form for webinar feedback. Please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. The links that follow are links to resources, to relevant resources related to this webinar's topic. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available soon after in our video library. Before we go over the agenda, I want to speak briefly about the Safe People and Data Initiative. The Safe People and Data Initiative is something new that the team at Debility have spearheaded, which we hope to grow through your participation and support. Some months now into the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure it is now clear to most people that a business-as-usual approach to continued data collection for research, monitoring, and evaluation is not possible. With this in mind, we want to help advance safety-focused practice in the sector that we serve. This means going beyond the technology, which is still important, into discussions around new practices and mixed approaches to data collection to help deepen our collective understanding. Our hope is that through experience, creative problem solving, and sharing, we can learn to continue generating the primary data evidence base that we all rely on, not only in a safe way, but in a more efficient way than before. The world has already changed, and we feel that this initiative can provide an opportunity to connect, learn from one another, and reach a new level in the work that we do together. We would love to hear from you about how you're adapting and changing your approach to work. If the revisions you're making fall into the scope of the Safe People and Data Initiative, and if you're keen to share, please get in touch with us. Take a look at the homepage of the initiative on our website and write to us. The initiative homepage is amongst the links that I've shared with you. To start things off, here is an overview of what we'll cover in this webinar. What is decentralized deployment? How to recruit remotely? How to onboard teams remotely, how to train remote research teams, how supervisors can remotely accompany interviewers. Note that I have copied links to these resources into the chat window, and we're also going to email you this list of links later on, so you'll be able to focus on the presentation at hand. Okay, so what is decentralized deployment? What does it mean? The broader concept is that of getting your research team, devices, and software all prepared, ready to conduct interviews and data collection, all remotely. In most parts of the world, there is an imperative to avoid making physical contact, and that has a few ingredients. When you don't have a team, you'll need to recruit one remotely, conducting employment interviews over the phone or video calls. Training your team remotely is also important, seeing as you won't be able to meet in person. This is internet dependent, and there are different strategies depending on how good or bad the internet connection your remote team will be using is. Unless truly unavoidable, you'll want your team to use the equipment and devices they have on hand for safety's sake. If you're running CATI interviews, different configurations of devices can be workable, using one for calls and for data capture, or two devices with one for calls and the other used for data input. This is something we discuss in our CATI guide. Lastly, and most important for our presentation, getting your team set up with the software you'll be using as uniformly as possible is crucial for the beginners on your team and for experienced team members. So let's discuss remote recruitment just briefly. So this isn't the focus of our webinar. Something that hasn't changed at all is that a successful survey depends on the people who will be conducting interviews and making observations. So the quality of the team, including how well prepared they are, is very important. So who you hire to work on your project is actually quite a big decision. You could hire a survey research firm to solve all these problems for you. But we are aware that many SurveyCTO users prefer to manage their own fieldwork, staying connected with everything that's happening in the field. If you happen to have done a survey before in a particular part of the world, you might already have contacts of good enumerators that you could hire to work on your new study, which is always a great option. You could advertise online, but you might have reasonable doubts as to whether online adverts are the best way to find experienced enumerators for your project, depending on the country. Staffing agencies and labor brokers are also something to consider, but unless they have some sort of focus on research, they may not have experienced enumerators available for your projects. So otherwise, these challenges are probably quite familiar, I'm guessing, because recruitment generally happens at a distance. It's not as if you stick up adverts yourself to recruit enumerators off the street, but I would love to discuss this in a little bit of detail in the Q&A. So if you have been recruiting people remotely, please let us know later how you are approaching that. Just briefly, I'm seeing in the chat, one of our attendees, Prince, is struggling to hear or view. I think this might be a problem that Prince is having. Is anybody else having a problem seeing the presentation or hearing me? Or are we all good still? Okay, so no issue with at least two of us. Okay, 3, 4, 5, okay. Okay, that's enough. I think we're all good on the technical side. So apologies, Prince. I think you're experiencing local technical difficulty. See what you can do, but you'll always be able to view the recording later. Thanks everybody who chimed in there. Okay, so that's remote recruitment. That's an important part of the picture. Right, so now on to decentralized deployment with SurveyCTO. This will likely be the most interesting and newest part of our presentation. Anyone who has set up SurveyCTO Collect on a device knows that there are a number of steps that are required. These steps are not difficult, but they are necessary in order to get up and running so you can start filling out forms. I'm wondering, has anybody in attendance ever had to talk somebody through setting up SurveyCTO Collect over the phone, giving instructions to an enumerator how to set up their own device? Is that something that you've done? Okay, well, I have one yes. I was just hoping for one yes, so that's great. Anyway, if you have had this experience, you know that talking somebody through that challenge can be difficult, but there is a much better way of approaching that today, and I'm going to talk you through that. So we've just recently made 2 brand new features available to make remotely setting up SurveyCTO Collect on Android much easier and faster, and generally more consistent. However, the primary purpose of these features is that they allow you to set up SurveyCTO Collect remotely. The first new feature is what we call Quick Setup. The Quick Setup process allows you to generate a link that will guide the user through installing and configuring SurveyCTO Collect. The second is a related feature called Default Device Configurations. Default device configurations store SurveyCTO settings and instructions on how to automatically download forms and any related cases data set. This also allows you to save time, making the setup process easy for enumerators and allowing you to operate in a decentralized way. This also allows you to simplify training because you can rely upon a polished default device configuration rather than training your enumerators to set up the device thoroughly themselves. These features are supported for the time being only on the early release version of SurveyCTO Collect, not the official version via the Play Store. However, until these new features are merged into the official release, the quick setup process will direct users to install the early release. So the process is actually made a little easier in that respect. Okay, so that's the background for the quick setup. I'm now going to walk you through the process. So if you want to review the slides later, which will be shared, and the video, you'll be able to step through and do the same. So if you want to to help your team to get set up with SurveyCTO Collect remotely, your work starts on the Collect tab of the server console. You might have already seen this new mobile data collection section. There are two new actions you can take on the mobile data collection section. You can share a quick setup link with SurveyCTO Collect users or enumerators who are not yet Collect users. And you can also create default device configurations at the bottom. Even though default device configurations come second, we suggest that you create one of these first. So you would click on this button to create default device configuration. So in this version of things, that's how we'll start. Okay, so this button at the bottom gets clicked. Okay, so then this next set of options appears. If I clicked on the Create Default Device Configuration button, this is what you'll see. First, you will pick the user role. Default device configurations are uniquely associated with user roles. If you've mostly used SurveyCTO on a single team server, you would not strictly have needed to learn much about user roles. Regardless, I suggest that you do some reading about user roles. Amongst the links I've shared, there is the documentation on user roles. In the screenshots, you'll see the basic global user roles that you're probably familiar with. Depending on your needs, the global data collection only user role with a single device default configuration could be enough. However, I just want to make it clear that you can create as many custom user roles that you would like. And each custom user role, and it could be a data collection only user role, exactly like the global role, could have its own default device configuration. You could do this once per project so that each project has its own unique configuration, but maybe as an organization, you decide on one configuration that works for all projects. Both are possible. Again, so going back to the top level of what we're doing, you pick the user role and you click the next button in the bottom right of the screen. That reveals another screen, and you have a few more options to configure. So after clicking on next, you'll want to configure some of these options. You don't need to do all of these. These are all optional, but it does make sense to consider each. So first, we recommend that you add a SurveyCTO Collect settings option. So here you would click on the button to receive settings from Collect, and from SurveyCTO Collect, you would enter the admin settings, and inside admin settings, there's a contextual menu button for sending settings from Collect to the server. I'll show you what this looks like on the next slide. But the idea is you configure the device once, exactly how you like it, and then everybody gets the same settings. You can also choose to have the cases dataset associated with that user role sent out with the default device configuration. Each user role has the option of setting up an association with the cases dataset, so that's useful if you use case management. Forms can also be included with a default device configuration, which is great because that allows you to make sure that enumerators already have the forms that they need. In fact, if you use some of the other early release features that we have for automatically installing form updates, you can also hide the whole process of downloading or getting blank forms and simplify the user interface. And that way the team only see the forms that they need. It's also possible to include additional instructions. The extra instructions here are a message that flashes on the screen when the when the default device configuration has finished installing. So it could be whatever message that you have for your team at this point. So once you've set up the options that you like for your project, click on the Save button. So just going back a little bit, if you recall, there was that button on the previous step that said Receive Settings from Collect. Your path to send those settings from Collect looks like this. You would open SurveyCTO Collect on a device, find the three-dot icon in the upper right of the app, and open the admin settings. And again, you would tap on that same button to open the menu in the top right, and you would tap on this button that says Send Settings to the server. As soon as you've done that, SurveyCTO on the server console will confirm that those settings are received. And we can see that on the next slide, because we're back on the console. You can see here, settings received from, this is the username from this device on such and such a date. If you want, you could delete this. You could also receive new settings to replace it. Here, the only setting which I have configured is I've decided to include a form. However, I could include as many forms as I like. I could enable this one, that one. I could search for others, whatever you like, exactly. Okay, so lastly in this process, how can you set up SurveyCTO Collect with a quick setup link? There are a few options. If you are in Office or you choose to send this QR code for scanning to someone, it can be displayed and scanned, which will start the quick setup process. However, the QR code contains the URL that you see, and the URL can just as easily be sent. You can distribute it by email, via WhatsApp, however you like. All the user needs to do is scan the QR code or open the link. They will need a username and a password for the app to run the quick setup process. If you look at the end of the URL, it actually has the server name to use. I've actually made this blue in the screenshot. So you won't want to edit that, but you can customize the link further with the customize button that you can see below the download option for the QR code. This setting involves an option to add a username into the link as well, if your team happen to be using the same user account, which is sometimes what you want to do. Okay, so at this point, the user has either tapped on the link or scanned the QR code. And we'll take a look at what happens on SurveyCTO Collect. So the person who scanned the link or tapped on the link will be directed to the web page you see on the left of this slide. They can follow the instructions to install SurveyCTO Collect. Remember that this page for now will direct the user to install the early release version of SurveyCTO Collect, which is required. Then, once they've installed it, they can launch the quick setup process. You can see this page in the middle of this slide. All they do is enter the server name. Well, actually, no, sorry, the server name will be populated by the link. The username might be populated depending on whether you decided to customize the link and include it, but they might need to enter that, and the password is required. And all they do is tap on the Run Quick Setup button, which initializes SurveyCTO Collect. With that initialized, settings will be applied. So here we can see what happened on the right. The default device settings were applied. One form was downloaded. And here, my custom instruction message appears at the bottom of the link. And that's really it. Those are the ingredients. So I'll just go over that in bullet point form. To summarize, the steps were to create a default device configuration for a user role for a new project, or it could just be the default device configuration that your organization uses. You could choose whether to add device settings and default forms into that configuration. You send out the link to new team members. Enumerators install SurveyCTO Collect from the setup, and they run the quick setup on their devices from the app, and then they're ready to go. Well, of course, there are some other things that you'll want to do with your team, but at least from a software perspective, they can be up and running. Something else that you'll definitely want to take care of is training. Obviously, people need more help than only setting up their devices. They need to understand the project. So just like configuring equipment, training that happens remotely is also important to help keep you and your team safe, operating in a decentralized way. This does have its challenges, but fortunately, learning at physical distance isn't a new thing. I would bet that a high number amongst the audience today has at some point registered and participated in an online course for some topic that was interesting to you. Many of the principles of delivering remote learning, like in an online course, are similar to what you might need to achieve. However you approach remote training for your teams, we suggest that you start with learning objectives. What do you want trainees to know and understand by the time that they've completed your training schedule? Not only that, how can you measure those learning outcomes in a way that would make you confident that a trainee was ready to undertake the task ahead? So for objectives, I'll suggest that you want the trainees to understand how their data collection software works. That's one part. And they should also understand how the primary data collection part of your study works, including the concepts that inform the research. How you communicate these depends on the resources and barriers that you face. So I mentioned before that low connectivity settings for trainees will require more reliance on reading text and less focus on multimedia-enabled learning. It's unfortunate, but it's a restriction. However, while slow connections might be an impediment to live training of videos and screen sharing, video streaming services like YouTube are actually optimized for most connection speeds and screen sizes. So if you are able to pre-prepare video content, it should actually work well for streaming for most content. Only the very worst internet connections won't allow this. But it's important to understand what you're working with while you are planning your resources. The last point I wanted to make about remote training is that you should design knowledge assessment into the training and material right from the start. Think about tests, quizzes, and ways that the user can demonstrate practical knowledge. You want to use all of this as evidence to decide that the people who've done the training know enough to be entrusted to do the work that you ask them to do. You'll have no other way of knowing, especially if you are training people remotely. So please think about assessment. To learn more about this, I suggest that you take a look at our remote training guide. We've built out a remote training guide aimed at computer-assisted telephone interviewing projects, and it's one of the resources that I've linked you to already. We're getting towards the end of our webinar. I want to speak briefly just about remote accompaniment, which is another piece of decentralized deployment. So what is remote accompaniment? As you're probably familiar, a big part of SurveyCTO's focus on adapting to more safe ways of data collection involves phone interviews, alongside face-to-face interviews, which are not so safe. Computer-assisted telephone interviews are still an interviewer-mediated data collection option. And that means there's still people involved in the collection of the data, and so it's important to monitor the performance of those people on the project to see how well your interviewers are doing. One option is call recording, and audio auditing happens to help to some degree. Although due to some Android security limitations, recording isn't always possible on Android. However, you can use third-party services like Twilio and Exetel for call recording. So those are some additional options to think about. However, whether you're recording calls and listening to interviews after the fact or not, remote accompaniment can be a complement or substitute to your processes. So just like with face-to-face interviews, where a supervisor might be present during an interview, sitting there physically to listen into an interview. The same is possible over the phone. This is quite straightforward to do as well, thanks to widely supported call conferencing technology. So what happens is that the enumerator would first call the supervisor and have them on the line. Then they would patch in the respondent. And once the respondent answers, the enumerator can merge the two calls. The supervisor sits in on the call, listens, keeps themselves on mute, and then they have the option of having a post-interview debrief where the supervisor gives the interviewer some pointers and some advice about their conduct and how to improve for follow-up interviews. So remote accompaniment can be a great aid to both training, data quality, while also keeping everybody involved safe, because everything is happening at a distance. We also have a guide on executing remote accompaniment. So do take a look at the resources that we'll email you later and the ones that I've sent out in the chat.